I realized as I was going through some of my sermons, I realized I've got a sermon, a created creatures, I want to share with you this morning. Kind of break up our study on where the Bible came from. This lesson this morning is an old lesson, and it was a lesson I looked at. There's a couple that come to mind when I do this lesson. Years ago, I used to preach at Wolf Creek in Morgan County. And there's a couple up there by the name of Harmon and Carolyn Thomas. Now, I'm not exactly sure how many years they've been married to date, but I know that it's over 60. They're almost 70 years of marriage. I believe they celebrated their 65th wedding anniversary a year or so ago. And so they are pushing 70 years of marriage. And so when I think about this lesson, I think about Harmon and Carolyn Thomas. If you will, I want you to think about the Swans. Swans are what we would call, and I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of this word, but monogamy, which means it's a form of a relationship in which an individual has only one partner during their entire lifetime. Swans occasionally will have a second partner if the first one dies, but even that is very rare and very seldom. Most of the time, swans have one partner for the duration of their lifetime. And so I thought about this as the way it works with marriage, the way God designed marriage for us to work. And swans are not the only creature that does this. But when we look at God's creation, we look at things that oftentimes symbolize something. And swans are often used as a symbol of love. And that reason they're used as a symbol of love is the lasting dedication that swans have for each other. And so I want to remember that when we get married, when you who may not be married, when you say your vows, you are committing to something greater than yourselves. Swans themselves, they mature, their sexual maturity level is somewhere depending on the species of swans. And what I have chosen to use for this PowerPoint is primarily what you're seeing is the mute swan. But they range between 4 and 7 years of age. The thing that gets me, though, is swans don't wait until they're 4 to 7 years old before they choose a mate. Sometimes they will pair up as early as 20 months old, so a little bit under 2 years, and these swans will pair up and they will mate for their entire lifetime, which that lifetime spans around 20 years. So at 2 years of age, give or take a little bit, swans decide who they're going to spend the remainder of their lifetime with. Well, let me ask you this. If animals make this decision, and God's created creatures realize that they are dedicated to another individual for the remainder of their life, yet they do this at a very early age level. Why is it so difficult for us as human beings? Matthew chapter 19. I want to go back. I want you to see what Jesus has to say on this particular topic of marriage for life. Marriage is a lifelong commitment, and we learn that by God's created creatures. A lot of God's created creatures, not all of them, but a lot of God's created creatures, God designed in this manner, to be dedicated to something greater than themselves, and so they mate for life. Swans are just one example of those created creatures. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, beginning in verse 8 of that chapter, we see here one of the Pharisees came to Jesus and they're wanting to test him. So let's back up to verse 3. And a Pharisee came up to him and tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Now, once you see, therein lies the trap, for any cause. He answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? Okay, that excludes all other relationships, all other letters of the alphabet that you will, in the sexual alphabet soup we have in today's culture. In the beginning, God made male and female. Okay? Jesus asked this question, have you not read? Do you not understand Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3? He said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast. Your King James Version will use the word cleave to his wife. And the two shall become one flesh. This is a concept that you might not completely understand what God has in mind by this until you're married. But you'll understand this once you're married, that you are no longer two individuals. You are a unit called a family. So there are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. They said to him, why then did Moses give a certificate of divorce to send her away? He said to them, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. Jesus goes on talking about divorce in verse 9. He says, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. I want you to notice something that his disciples made an observation of in verse 10. His disciples said to him, if such is the case with a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. They made an observation. I find this very interesting. These are good guys. They're dedicated to their wives as far as we can tell, and yet they make an observation. If you can't get out of that relationship, you're better not to marry. Jesus also makes a response to that. Some people can do that. Others cannot. But I want you to think about this. Jesus says that from the beginning, divorce was not in the mind of God. Our commitment when we get married, just like the swan, is not just to each other, but our commitment is to God. We make those vows when we get up and we say our vows. We make those vows not just to each other and not just to a group of people who are gathered there to witness that. What they are witnessing is not the vows that we make to each other so much as the promises we are making before God. In Ephesians chapter 5, and I want us to look at particularly Ephesians chapter 5 and down in verse 21 of that chapter. This chapter will reference Ephesians chapter 5 several times throughout this morning's study. But the Apostle Paul writes, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. The reason why marriage is important and the reason why it's important to be dedicated to each other is that we are submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. The Apostle Paul, right here in Ephesians chapter 5, several times references Christ and the church. In our marriage relationship, he talks about Christ and the church. You might want to put your marker there in Ephesians chapter 5. We'll refer back to there from time to time. But turn with me to 1 Peter chapter 5. And look at what Peter has to say about our dedication, not just to each other, but also to Christ. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5 of that chapter. Peter says, likewise, you who are younger, submit to the elder. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility. I want you to keep that in mind, very much so. I've been married for a number of years, not as long as some of you. But I know one thing, humility plays a key part, not only in our Christian walk with Christ, but humility plays a key part in a successful marriage. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility towards one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties. Now, I know nobody who's ever been married has ever been anxious about anything. Okay, I'm being facetious. You have my permission to laugh. But God says, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Friends, I believe that it is quite possible that because of marriage complications, a great deal of people lose their relationship with God, or strain, at the very least, their relationship with God.